Good morning, church.
Good morning.
Have you ever walked into a room and immediately realized that you'd walked in on something?
Yes.
Sometimes you can tell by the way the subject of the conversation instantly changes, right? Suddenly they start talking about something completely different. Perhaps the expression on everybody's face seems stressed out or really intense. Have they been arguing about something, you might wonder? Or still worse, were they talking about me? Maybe they were talking about where I was on the naughty and nice list. In fact, sometimes I walked into an empty room and I could just tell that a place had seen some sort of division, a war, or deep sadness. Walk onto a Civil War battleground or one of the fortresses used in the slave trade with your spiritual eyes open for a moment, and I'm sure you'll know what I'm talking about. Amen?
Amen.
There are times when our soul is just queasy, or as they put it in Star Wars, Graham, when there is a disturbance in the force. When in the year or two of Jesus' birth, Magi came from the east, probably from Persia. They walked into King Herod's court and requested an audience with the recently born king of Israel. They yearned to pay him homage, honor, and worship. Apparently, whatever heavenly conjunction they had witnessed among the stars in the sky gave them cause for hope. They had made a long and arduous journey at great expense, all to give gifts to a baby king. They're said to have followed a star in the sky until they got near to Jerusalem. They stopped off at Herod's court, figuring that the child was most likely to have been born to the local royal family. It makes sense that a prince or a new king would be born to a king and queen. It's important to note that according to astrologers who ascribe meaning to celestial events in the sky, not every king born on earth got a heavenly announcement. Such events were reserved for truly great monarchs, incredible leaders of note. And perhaps this explains in some small way why they went to such extremes to seek this child out. Although the Magi were unlikely to have been believers in the God of Israel, or to have been aware of the prophecy of the Christ or coming Messiah, still the journey of these Magi meant that they had high hopes for this child's reign. That's what makes what they stepped into when they arrived at Herod's palace all the more disturbing. Where is the newborn king of the Jews, they asked. We've seen his star in the east, and we've come to honor him. Their words fell silent in the room, as the room looked like a near-fatal diagnosis from the doctor. Herod was troubled, Matthew writes, and everyone in Jerusalem with him. Herod was the kind of king that thrived on power over his subjects. He created grand building projects that made slaves out of his own people. Church, give a little guttural disgust today. Let's just say, ugh. Yeah, a puppet king of one of the most powerful empires on earth, the Roman Empire, Herod was willing to do anything to hold onto what power he had acquired. As he grew more suspicious of the people around him, he would eventually have his wife and 2 sons killed, in addition to a number of others. Church, say that's horrible.
That's horrible.
When he hears the news of the Messiah's birth from the Magi, he first sends them as his spies so he can kill the child. When they fail to report back to him, Herod massacres any children under 2 in Bethlehem. Church, let's express our disgust and say that's an atrocity. That's an atrocity. That's right. And with such an action, the biblical authors are reminding us the descendant of slaves in Egypt had himself become the very Pharaoh that God had once saved them from. One who had harshly enslaved his own people and who would eliminate any threat to his power. Herod had become a tyrant. Church, say tyrant.
Tyrant.
When the Magi came to Herod, we can imagine how agitated Herod became in that moment. A king? Here? And not under my thumb? How could these things be? All of Jerusalem was troubled because they all knew that Israel was a powder keg about ready to explode. The Romans depended on Herod to keep the Pax Romana. The Roman peace was like the original media spin. It was a choking kind of oppression maintained by a brutal army. And it was Herod's job to maintain that so-called peace. Moreover, perhaps all of Jerusalem was troubled because they worried about what Herod himself might do. What would he demand that they do in order to keep this peace? Who would pay the price for threatening the power of those in power? Surely the atrocity that followed was a realization of their collective fear. After all, the root of tyranny is a desire to maintain control over one's own life and over the people around them. The desire to maintain control is based in the fear of losing control. And so the self-protective facades that we erect today become the prison walls employed by our own fear to make us worry about what lies just beyond our control, outside our prison walls. Control, you see, must be 100% absolute, or it's not really control at all, is it? If there's something you can't control, then it seeps into what you can. And those who possess enough power to act on their tyrannical thirst will seek to seal every crack in their own prison walls. The holes in the stone, the windows, even the door must be bricked in a vain attempt to keep whatever threatens them out. Tyrants will push away or eliminate whoever they can't subjugate and manipulate. They use a diverse tool belt of violence to rebuke, oppress, and beat the world into submission to their will, so that they can hold on to whatever they fear losing most. Now, we're likely to make Herod out to be the bad guy here, I suppose, but his vicious, tyrannical nature is what happens. I guess that's not really that simple. There are so many examples of those who seek to reign by fear, as Herod did. To be sure, there are plenty of political leaders today, foreign and domestic, who act the same way, creating and capitalizing on the fear of others to secure their own power base. Their names get splashed on headlines all the time, because if they are ignored, then they can't be feared, can they? They must constantly remind us all why we should be afraid. We spend an awful lot of time worrying about what these despots will do with their armies, weapons, followers, and other resources. As human beings have extended their technological reach, so too we seem to have broadened the influence of humanity's tyrants, and all the world remains troubled. Amen?
Amen.
I wonder, though, do we act the same way? Brian McLaren reflects in his devotional, We Make the Road by Walking. The story of King Herod tells us once again that the world can't be simply divided between the good guys, us, and the bad guys, them. Because like Herod, members of us will behave no differently from them, given the power and the provocation. If we're being fair, we realize that while we may not have as much power as some elites do, we often use what power we do have to rule by fear. There are so many little tyrants in our everyday lives. Bosses who lord their power over others, parents who squash the dreams of their children, men and women who isolate and abuse their significant other through domestic violence, those who sexually abuse others through words or deeds, racists, homophobes, and everyone else who dictates the rules to everyone around them through the fear of ridicule, violence, or scorn. We reinforce sometimes the status quo when we know that it should be transformed, and we belittle those who offer ideas that would require effort or change on our part. We do it, I think, in part because it feels like our world is spinning out of control already, and these little changes seem like they are simply widening the cracks. Fear becomes a stifling story. We're so thoroughly steeped in the culture of fear that the best we can often imagine is to replace a tyrant with a tyrant. Perhaps one who happens to favor us. The prophecy of the Messiah, as first-century Israelites understood it, was a military leader who would use violence to supplant the current regime, who would be on the side of those who are currently out of power and move them into position of power. The best they could hope for, they figured, would be that this Messiah from God would be more conducive to their faith and more compassionate on the people who are currently living under oppression. But it seems doubtful that most people would believe it would really change the way the world worked. I mean, even 100 years so later, after the birth, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, people still envision Jesus as a kind of conqueror. The book of Revelation describes the Christ the same way one described one of the kings of old. Then I saw heaven opened, and there was a white horse, the book of Revelation writes. Its rider was called Faithful and True, and he judges and makes war justly. He wore a robe dyed with blood, and his name was called the Word of God. Revelation 19, 11 and 13. Church, can't we imagine something better than that? When we tire of old men sitting in offices and palaces, making decisions that cause the death of their children and grandchildren. Perhaps we will start to dream a bigger dream. Well, we can, because Jesus has already shown us the way. A child born to a poor couple of weak reputation reminds us that power over is not the only way to live our lives. We aren't to be bound, in fact, by fear or to allow it to make us its servant. If we live our lives afraid of what we might lose, then we never feel we have anything really to offer. And that is, in fact, a lie. Marshall McFear reminds us that fear stands for false evidence appearing real. F-E-A-R. False evidence appearing real. Instead of demanding to be served, of worrying that what we will have will be taken from us, and laboring to make sure that it doesn't happen, the follower in the way of Jesus notes how God became weak and lived among us and lived a rich life. How the Lord of heaven and earth worked tirelessly under the power of human regimes and empires, serving everyone that God encountered and showing us a very different way to live. So the opposite of tyranny, it turns out, isn't really democracy. It's servanthood. And the opposite of fear isn't calm either. It's hope. When we throw away the dominating culture of fear and self-preservation, we liberate ourselves. We come alongside the weak and the downtrodden, and we use whatever power we have to empower those around us. We lift them up, and we become their advocates and their champions when they cannot champion their own cause, and make them into advocates and champions for themselves. We ally ourselves with the poverty-stricken, with the powerless, and with the perpetually overlooked and the outcast. Instead of trying to lead by controlling everything, we long to use what is under our control a little bit better. You know, the choir and I were reflecting outside a little while ago about our voices sort of trembling this morning. You know, how this time of year, we get to the end of the year and everybody gets a little bit sick. And we said, Lord, this was my prayer. I said, Lord, please help us. I hope I got this right. But Lord, please help us, of little voice, to use what voice we have well. To proclaim you, Lord, with all of our might, all of our strength, all that we have. Help us to do it with a little love and to have the hope that what we have will always be enough in your hands when we lay our gifts at your feet. Isn't that a better way to live our lives? Isn't that really what Jesus modeled? God laid God's own life at the feet of Mary and Joseph and said, take all that I am and all that I have and make this world better. And Mary and Joseph must have done something right because Jesus grew up pretty well. Isn't that a better way to live? Church, we don't have to live under tyranny. We don't have to live in the culture of fear. We have instead what Christ has offered us in the babe of Bethlehem. A new culture, a revolution of hope. In Jesus' name.
Amen.